And now, the centerpiece of the evening, the Isabella diamond. Do I have 50 million?
50 million.
50 million going once, twice.
Wait, I object.
Stop the auction.
Maya! Maya! Richard, that ring belongs to my family.
Here, I believe this belongs to you.
This is absurd. What is this? Read it.
No, this isn't possible. There's a seam. I think I found it.
It's moving. It's moving.
You kept it. For all these years.
Some truths stay buried for years, until the wrong person tries to sell them. The crystal chandelier cast warm gold across the ballroom, scattering light over polished marble floors and rows of elegantly dressed guests. Soft piano music drifted through the air, while servers moved quietly between tables carrying silver trays and glasses of sparkling water. At the center of it all stood Richard Whitmore. Tall, distinguished, and impossibly composed, the billionaire held up a small velvet box as hundreds of eyes followed the movement. The room responded with polite applause. Tonight marked 5 years since the death of his wife, Eleanor Whitmore. 5 years since the tragedy that had filled magazine covers, dominated headlines, and left one of the wealthiest men in America permanently changed. A massive portrait of Eleanor stood near the grand staircase, illuminated by soft white lights. Her smile seemed frozen in another lifetime. Richard barely glanced at it anymore. "This ring," he said, his voice calm and practiced, "has remained locked away since Eleanor's passing. Tonight, all proceeds from its auction will benefit the Whitmore Foundation." More applause followed. Cameras flashed. Several wealthy donors leaned forward in anticipation. Inside the velvet box rested a stunning diamond ring surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light like fragments of ice. It was beautiful, rare, worth a fortune, but to Richard, it was something else entirely. It was the final reminder of a marriage he believed had ended long before Eleanor died. His fingers tightened slightly around the box. Years ago, rumors had surfaced. Private messages, missing explanations, unanswered questions. By the time Eleanor was gone, Richard had convinced himself he knew the truth. The woman he loved had betrayed him. The ring represented that betrayal. Tonight, he intended to let it go forever. Across the room, standing near a service entrance, Maya Brooks lowered her eyes toward the polished floor. Her housekeeping uniform looked almost invisible among the tuxedos and designer gowns surrounding her. A folded cleaning cloth rested in her hands. She wasn't supposed to be part of the event. She had simply been assigned to assist the staff and remain unnoticed. That was how most people preferred her, unnoticed. For 8 years, Maya had worked quietly inside the Whitmore estate. She knew which floorboards creaked after midnight. She knew where Eleanor liked to sit during thunderstorms. She knew how many teaspoons of sugar Eleanor secretly added to her tea despite her doctor's instructions. And she knew something else. Something nobody else in that ballroom knew. Her gaze drifted toward the ring. A chill moved through her chest. Richard lifted the box higher. An auction representative stepped forward with a smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, bidding will begin at $2 million. Maya's breath caught. The piano music continued. Glasses clinked softly. Guests adjusted in their seats. Nobody noticed the housekeeper standing silently against the wall. Nobody except the memory she had carried for 5 years. A memory she had promised herself she would never reveal unless she absolutely had to. Richard opened his mouth to continue. Maya took one step forward, then another. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it over the music. Every instinct told her to stay quiet, stay invisible, stay safe. But the moment the auctioneer reached for the ring, she finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet somehow it sliced through the ballroom like a blade through silk. "Sir," the room seemed to pause. Richard frowned slightly. Maya swallowed hard and looked directly at him. "That ring isn't yours." Silence fell so completely that even the piano players stopped moving. No one spoke. The silence seemed to stretch across the ballroom like a sheet of glass ready to crack. Maya Brooks immediately wished she could pull the words back into her chest, but it was too late. Every face had turned toward her. Wealthy donors stood frozen beside white linen tables. Servers stopped mid-step. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Richard Whitmore stared at her from across the room, the velvet box still resting in his hand. For a moment, He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man struggling to understand what he had just heard. Maya felt dozens of eyes pressing against her. She lowered her gaze briefly before lifting it again. 8 years of working inside the Whitmore estate had taught her many things. It had taught her how to move quietly through rooms full of important people. It had taught her how to become invisible when conversations turned uncomfortable. Most importantly, it had taught her when silence protected the truth and when silence buried it. Tonight, she could no longer stay silent. The auction representative cleared his throat nervously. No one seemed to know what to do next. Richard slowly closed the velvet box. The faint click echoed louder than it should have. "Maya," he said calmly, though his voice carried a warning beneath it. "What exactly are you talking about?" Hearing her name spoken aloud in front of everyone made her stomach tighten. She had spent years being known only as the housekeeper. The woman who dusted shelves. The woman who polished windows. The woman who quietly disappeared whenever guests arrived. Yet Eleanor had always called her Maya. Eleanor had always looked her in the eye. The memory struck unexpectedly. Maya could still picture the sunlight that used to pour through the breakfast room windows during late spring mornings. She could still hear Eleanor laughing softly over a cup of tea. She could still remember the kindness that seemed effortless. Eleanor Whitmore never treated staff like furniture. She remembered birthdays. She remembered family names. She remembered dreams people had stopped talking about. 8 years earlier, when Maya first arrived at the estate after caring for her sick grandmother, Eleanor had been the first person to welcome her. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. "You do not need to be afraid here," Eleanor had told her during her first week. Maya had never forgotten those words. Unfortunately, after Eleanor passed away, the estate changed. The hallways remained beautiful. The gardens remained perfect. The marble floors still reflected sunlight like mirrors. But warmth slowly disappeared. Richard became distant. Conversations became shorter. Doors remained closed longer. The mansion felt larger and colder at the same time. Maya understood grief. She understood how loss could build walls around a person's heart. That was why she had kept Eleanor's secret for so long. She believed one day Richard would find peace on his own. One day he would discover the truth himself. But that day never came. Instead, year after year, she watched him become more convinced of a story that was not real. Richard stepped forward now, his polished shoes crossing the marble floor. "Explain yourself," he said. The guests exchanged nervous glances. Maya could feel her pulse in her throat. She carefully folded the cleaning cloth between her hands. "Because Mrs. Whitmore trusted me," she said quietly. "And because she asked me to remember something if she could not tell you herself." A ripple moved through the crowd. Richard's expression hardened. Yet beneath the anger, something else flickered. Uncertainty. For the first time that evening, Maya noticed his hand tighten around the velvet box. He looked at the ring differently now. Not as an object. Not as a symbol of resentment. As a question. And questions, Maya knew, were far more dangerous than answers. Richard did not answer immediately. The ballroom remained suspended in uneasy silence while the soft glow of the chandeliers reflected across rows of uncertain faces. Somewhere near the back of the room, a glass touched a table with a faint click that sounded far louder than it should have. Maya stood perfectly still. She knew she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. For years she had avoided this moment. For years she had carried memories that did not belong to her. Richard slowly descended the small platform where the auction presentation had been taking place. The velvet box remained closed in his hand. His expression revealed little, but Maya recognized something she had not seen in a very long time. He was listening, not agreeing, not trusting, listening. "You are telling me," Richard said carefully, "that my wife left you with information she never shared with me." The question hung in the air. Maya lowered her eyes briefly. "She tried to," she answered. "More than once." A murmur spread through the crowd. Richard's jaw tightened. 5 years of grief had hardened him into a man who rarely allowed surprises. Yet tonight, surprises seemed determined to find him. He glanced toward the enormous portrait beside the staircase. Eleanor's painted smile remained unchanged, untouched by the tension filling the room beneath it. Maya remembered the real smile. Warm, patient, sometimes mischievous, especially during the final months. The memory pulled her backward through time. 5 years earlier, autumn sunlight had spilled across the estate's conservatory. Golden leaves drifted beyond the glass walls while Eleanor sat alone near the fountain, turning the ring slowly around her finger. Maya had entered carrying tea and found her staring into the water. "You look worried, Mrs. Whitmore," Maya had said. Eleanor had smiled, but only for a moment. "Have you ever known something important and not known how to say it?" she asked quietly. Maya remembered placing the tea beside her. "Every family has things that are difficult to talk about." Eleanor had laughed softly at that. "That may be the most honest thing anyone has told me all week." Then her gaze drifted toward the ring. She touched it again. Not proudly, not lovingly, almost sadly. "Sometimes people see an object," Eleanor had whispered, "but they do not see the story attached to it." Maya never forgot those words. Back in the present, Richard studied her carefully. "And this story," he said, "you believe it changes something?" Maya met his eyes. "I know it does." The certainty in her voice unsettled him. Several board members shifted uncomfortably nearby. One donor checked his watch. Another quietly stepped away from the auction table. The evening was no longer proceeding according to plan. Richard looked down at the box in his hand. 5 years. 5 years of unanswered questions. 5 years of believing Eleanor had hidden things from him. 5 years of convincing himself that the distance between them had been her choice. Yet beneath all of that certainty lived a smaller truth he rarely acknowledged. Part of him had never stopped wondering if he had been wrong. Maya saw that struggle unfolding behind his eyes. It gave her courage. "Mrs. Whitmore asked me to remember one thing," she said. Richard's attention snapped back to her. "What thing?" Maya took a slow breath. The words felt heavier now than they had 5 years ago. She said that if the day ever came when someone tried to separate the ring from the truth, I could not stay silent. The room fell still again. Richard's fingers tightened around the velvet box. For the first time that evening, uncertainty outweighed anger. And deep inside, a question he had buried for years finally began to wake. The ballroom no longer felt like a charity gala. It felt like a courtroom where nobody knew the verdict. Richard Whitmore stood motionless beneath the chandelier light, the velvet box resting heavily in his hand. Around him, conversations had vanished. Wealthy investors, foundation donors, business partners, and reporters watched the exchange unfold with growing curiosity. Maya could feel the weight of every stare, but she refused to look away. 5 years earlier, she had made a promise. Tonight, she intended to keep it. Richard finally spoke. "If Eleanor truly wanted me to know something, she had years to tell me herself." His voice remained controlled, but Maya noticed the strain beneath it. "She tried," Maya answered quietly. "Many times." Richard's eyes narrowed. Then why did she not? The question lingered between them. Maya remembered the answer immediately. She remembered long afternoons in the conservatory. She remembered hospital appointments Eleanor rarely discussed. She remembered moments when fear crept into conversations and quickly disappeared behind polite smiles. Most of all, she remembered how often Eleanor hesitated whenever Richard's name came up. Not because she did not love him, because she was afraid he had stopped trusting her. The memory returned with painful clarity. Nearly 6 years ago, rain had tapped softly against the glass roof of the conservatory while Eleanor sat with a stack of unopened letters beside her. Maya had been trimming flowers nearby when Eleanor suddenly asked a question. "Do you think trust can come back once it leaves?" Maya remembered setting down the garden shears. "I think people can find their way back to each other if they want to." Eleanor had stared out at the storm. What if only one person is looking for the way back? Maya never forgot the sadness in her voice. Back in the present, Richard took another step closer. "What exactly are you claiming?" Maya felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment she had feared for years. "I am saying Mrs. Whitmore knew the ring carried something important." A few guests exchanged confused looks. One reporter quietly reached for a phone. Richard's expression hardened again. "It is a ring, Maya." "No, sir," she replied. "It is a message." The room stirred. Richard let out a slow breath. "You expect me to believe that after 5 years? I expect you to remember who Eleanor was." That answer landed harder than Maya intended. Richard fell silent. For a brief moment, the billionaire disappeared. In his place stood a widower haunted by memories he had spent years trying to outrun. Maya saw it happen. His gaze drifted toward Eleanor's portrait once more. The painting captured her elegance. It captured her smile. But it could never capture her kindness. It could never capture the way she remembered every employee's birthday or how she spent hours speaking with gardeners, drivers, and kitchen staff simply because she genuinely cared about people. Maya remembered all of it. Richard remembered it too. That was what made this so painful. "You should stop," one of the board members suddenly said from nearby. "This is becoming inappropriate." Several guests nodded. The tension immediately shifted. Maya knew what came next. She knew how rooms like this worked. Powerful people protected comfortable stories. Uncomfortable truths were usually shown the door. The board member adjusted his jacket and looked directly at Richard. "We have donors waiting. The auction should continue." Richard remained silent. Another guest added, "Whatever private concerns exist can be handled later." Maya lowered her eyes briefly. She understood exactly what they meant. A housekeeper should not interrupt a billionaire. A woman in a service uniform should not challenge the official version of events. She should apologize, step back, disappear. Instead, Maya slowly reached into the pocket of her housekeeping apron. The movement immediately caught Richard's attention. Her fingers closed around a small folded piece of paper that had yellowed with age. She had carried it for 5 years. 5 years of uncertainty. 5 years of waiting. 5 years of wondering whether she would ever need it. Richard stared at the folded paper. Something shifted in his expression. For the first time that evening, genuine concern appeared in his eyes. "Maya," he said quietly. "What is that?" Maya looked down at the worn edges of the paper. Then she looked back at him. "The reason I could never forget what Mrs. Whitmore asked me to remember." The folded paper looked insignificant in Maya's hand. A single yellowed sheet. Worn edges. Faded creases. Yet the moment Richard saw it, the atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted again. The board members who had been eager to move on suddenly fell silent. Reporters leaned forward. Guests exchanged uncertain glances. Maya could feel her heart beating against her ribs. She had protected this secret for years, never knowing whether revealing it would help anyone or simply reopen old wounds. Richard stared at the paper. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice was lower now, more cautious. Maya swallowed. "Mrs. Whitmore gave it to me herself." A sharp breath escaped someone near the front row. Richard's expression darkened. 5 years ago? Maya nodded. 3 weeks before she passed. The answer seemed to hit him harder than he expected. For several seconds he said nothing. Maya remembered that day perfectly. The memory had never faded. Late afternoon sunlight had filled the east sitting room. Eleanor sat beside the window wrapped in a cream-colored blanket while autumn leaves drifted across the lawn outside. Her strength had been fading, but her mind remained sharp. Maya had brought tea as usual. Eleanor had barely touched it. Instead, she held the folded paper in both hands. "Promise me something," Eleanor had said quietly. Maya remembered smiling. Of course. Eleanor's eyes had drifted toward the wedding ring resting on her finger. If Richard ever decides to let go of that ring before learning the truth, you must stop him. Maya had frowned. Why would he do that? Eleanor looked away. The sadness in her face answered the question before her words did. Because he believes something that is not true. Back in the ballroom, Maya carefully held the paper against her chest. Richard's gaze never left it. "You expect everyone here to believe that after all this time?" One board member interrupted. This could be anything. Several guests nodded. The challenge was reasonable. Maya understood that. A billionaire's reputation, a family's history, and a charity foundation were now hanging on the words of a housekeeper. She understood exactly how unlikely that sounded. Richard slowly extended his hand. "Give it to me." Maya hesitated. Not because she distrusted him. Because she knew once he read the contents, there would be no returning to the life he had built around his assumptions. The silence stretched. Finally, she stepped forward. The marble floor reflected the chandelier light beneath her shoes. Every movement felt amplified. Every breath felt heavier. She placed the folded paper into Richard's waiting hand. The room became completely still. Richard looked down at the paper. His fingers paused at the crease. For a brief moment, he seemed afraid to open it. Maya recognized that fear. It was the fear of discovering that years of certainty had been built on the wrong foundation. Slowly, he unfolded the page. The old paper crackled softly. His eyes moved across the first line, then stopped. Maya watched the color leave his face. Guests immediately noticed the change. One reporter lowered his phone. Another guest leaned forward in confusion. Richard continued reading. His jaw tightened, then loosened. His eyes returned to the beginning and read the first paragraph again. Maya remembered every word written there because Eleanor had read them aloud before sealing the page. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he reached the signature at the bottom. Eleanor Whitmore, his wife, the woman he had spent 5 years mourning and misunderstanding. A long silence followed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, Richard lifted his eyes from the page and looked directly at Maya. The anger was gone. The certainty was gone. In their place was something far more fragile. Doubt. Deep, unsettling doubt. Then his gaze dropped toward the velvet box still resting in his other hand. For the first time in 5 years, he looked at the ring as though he had never truly seen it before. The ballroom seemed to fade around Richard Whitmore. The voices were gone. The reporters were gone. The auction tables, the donors, the cameras, all of it blurred into the background until only 2 things remained clear in his mind: the letter in his hand and the ring resting inside the velvet box. He lowered himself slowly into a nearby chair, something he had not planned to do, something he rarely allowed himself to do in public. For years he had carried himself like a man who could not bend under pressure. Tonight, the weight was different. Tonight, the pressure came from memory. A soft rain had begun outside. Tiny droplets tapped gently against the tall ballroom windows. The sound was almost soothing. Richard stared at Eleanor's handwriting. He knew every curve of it, every letter, every habit. She used to leave notes on the refrigerator, notes beside his morning coffee, notes tucked inside books she wanted him to read. For a moment, he could almost hear her voice again. Not the voice from hospital rooms or difficult conversations. The voice from before. The voice that laughed too easily and filled empty rooms with warmth. Maya remained standing several feet away. She did not speak. She did not defend herself. She did not push for answers. She simply waited. The same way she had waited through countless difficult days inside the Whitmore estate. The same way she had waited while grief slowly transformed the house into something colder. Richard continued reading. The letter was not long. Eleanor had never wasted words. Yet every sentence seemed to unravel years of assumptions. She wrote about misunderstandings, about fear, about people who benefited when trust disappeared. She wrote that she had tried repeatedly to explain certain things, but never found the right moment. Most painful of all, she wrote that she worried he had already stopped believing her before she could finish telling the truth. Richard closed his eyes. The words settled heavily inside him. Across the room, guests remained silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever was happening. Even the board members who had objected earlier now seemed uncertain. The confidence they carried before had weakened. The atmosphere no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the truth slowly emerging from the past. Maya looked toward the rain-covered windows. Reflections from the chandelier shimmered across the glass like scattered stars. She remembered another rainy evening years ago. Eleanor had stood in the library watching a storm roll across the property. People think regret arrives all at once, Eleanor had said quietly. But sometimes it arrives one memory at a time. Maya had not understood those words then. She understood them now. Richard finally lifted his head. His eyes looked older than they had an hour earlier. Not weaker, just tired, deeply tired, as though he had spent 5 years carrying a burden that no longer fit the facts in front of him. He looked toward the portrait beside the staircase. The painted smile remained unchanged, but something inside him shifted. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder whether Eleanor had been waiting all this time for him to see what he had missed. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Nobody moved. Nobody rushed the moment. Maya lowered her eyes to the polished marble floor. She had feared this night for years. Yet standing there now, she felt something unexpected. Not relief. Not victory. Only sadness for two people who had loved each other and somehow become separated by silence. Richard looked down once more at the ring inside the velvet box. Then he noticed something he had never paid attention to before. Along the inner edge of the band, barely visible beneath the diamond setting, was a tiny seam. Small, precise, almost impossible to notice. His breath caught. Slowly, very slowly, he turned the ring toward the light. Richard's fingers tightened around the ring. The tiny seam caught the chandelier light for only a second before disappearing again. Anyone else would have missed it. He almost had. For 5 years the ring had remained locked away in a private safe. Untouched. Unquestioned. a symbol of pain he never wanted to examine too closely. Yet now, with Eleanor's letter still resting in his lap, he could not look away. Slowly, he rotated the band between his fingers. The room watched in complete silence. Maya remained near the edge of the ballroom, her hands folded in front of her. She remembered the first time Eleanor had shown her the hidden compartment. It had happened during one of their long afternoons in the conservatory. Eleanor had removed the ring, smiled faintly, and pressed a nearly invisible section along the inner band. A small mechanism clicked open. "Most people never notice it," she had said. "Richard does not even know it exists." Maya remembered laughing softly. Why hide something so important? Eleanor had stared at the ring for several seconds before answering. Because sometimes the truth needs a place to survive until someone is ready to hear it. Back in the ballroom, Richard carefully examined the seam. His heartbeat seemed louder than the rain tapping against the windows. Then he felt it. A slight movement beneath his thumb. A tiny click. Several guests gasped. The inner section of the ring shifted open by a fraction of an inch. Richard froze. The board members looked stunned. Reporters leaned forward. Maya closed her eyes briefly. After all these years, the moment had finally arrived. Richard carefully opened the hidden compartment. Inside was something folded so tightly it appeared no larger than a postage stamp. A tiny piece of paper protected within the ring itself. His breath caught. The room seemed to disappear again. He carefully removed the paper and unfolded it with trembling fingers. The writing was unmistakable. Eleanor's handwriting. Smaller than normal, but perfectly legible. Richard began reading. The first sentence struck him like a wave. Then the second. Then the third. His face drained of color. Maya saw the realization arrive in stages. Confusion. Shock. Disbelief. Then grief. Deep grief. The message was simple. Eleanor explained that she had discovered irregular financial transfers inside Whitmore Holdings years earlier. Transfers connected to someone Richard trusted completely. A longtime business partner. A man named Charles Mercer. Eleanor wrote that she had gathered evidence proving millions of dollars had been diverted through shell companies. When she confronted Charles privately, he denied everything. Days later, anonymous information began appearing that suggested Eleanor herself was hiding secrets from her husband. Carefully planted rumors. Manufactured misunderstandings. False evidence designed to create distance between husband and wife. Eleanor wrote that she spent months trying to uncover the full truth. She intended to show Richard everything. But before she could complete the investigation, her health declined rapidly. The final lines were addressed directly to him. Richard's eyes filled as he read them. "If you are reading this, it means I ran out of time. I never betrayed you. I never stopped loving you. The person who wanted us divided succeeded because silence grew where trust should have been. Please do not let that silence win forever." Richard lowered the paper. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The rain continued against the glass. The room seemed suspended between past and present. 5 years of certainty collapsed in less than a minute. Charles Mercer, his closest advisor, his most trusted friend, the man who had comforted him after Eleanor's death, the man who had quietly encouraged every suspicion, the man who had benefited from every broken piece of trust. Richard closed his eyes. The truth was no longer hidden. It sat in his hands for everyone to see. And across the ballroom, Maya Brooks stood exactly where she had always stood. Quiet, patient, carrying the truth long after everyone else had abandoned it. No one in the ballroom seemed to remember why they had come. The auction tables sat untouched. The cameras remained lowered. Even the rain outside sounded softer now, as if the night itself had paused to listen. Richard Whitmore remained seated, the hidden note resting in one hand and the ring in the other. For years he had believed he was carrying the pain of betrayal. Now he understood something. Far worse. He had spent 5 years doubting the one person who deserved his trust the most. The realization settled heavily across his shoulders. Across the room, Maya stood quietly near the service entrance. She did not look proud. She did not look victorious. She simply looked tired. Tired from carrying a burden that had never belonged to her. Richard slowly rose from his chair. The movement immediately drew every eye in the room. He looked toward the portrait of Eleanor standing beside the staircase. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked back at Maya. The distance between them suddenly felt larger than the ballroom itself. 8 years. 8 years she had worked inside his home. 8 years she had cared for the estate, respected his privacy, and protected a promise she never should have been forced to keep alone. Yet when the moment came, she had still chosen courage over comfort. Richard took several slow steps forward. The polished marble reflected the chandelier light beneath his shoes. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody dared. He stopped a few feet away from Maya. The silence deepened. "You knew," he said quietly. Maya nodded. "Only what Mrs. Whitmore wanted you to know." Richard looked down briefly. "And you kept this for 5 years." "I gave myself that same answer every day," Maya replied softly. "I hoped you would discover the truth before I ever had to speak." Her honesty struck him harder than any accusation could have. She was not angry. She was not seeking recognition. She was simply telling the truth. The same truth she had protected all these years. Richard lowered his eyes. For perhaps the first time in a very long time, the billionaire seemed uncertain what to say. Then he did something nobody expected. He turned toward the guests filling the ballroom. The board members stiffened. Reporters immediately raised their cameras again. Richard's voice carried clearly through the room. "Tonight was supposed to honor my wife's memory." He paused. Instead, it revealed how little I truly understood it. The confession landed heavily. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. Powerful men rarely admitted mistakes publicly. Richard continued. "For 5 years I believed a story that was not true. I allowed suspicion to replace trust. I allowed grief to replace understanding." His gaze drifted toward Eleanor's portrait once more. "And I nearly allowed the final evidence of her truth to disappear forever." The room remained silent. Richard then turned back toward Maya. His expression softened. "Mrs. Brooks." The formal address surprised her. It surprised everyone. "You protected my wife's voice when I failed to hear it myself." Maya lowered her eyes. Richard took another step forward. "Thank you." The words were simple, yet they carried more weight than any speech delivered that evening. Maya felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. Not because of the gratitude, because Eleanor had finally been heard. Richard carefully held up the ring. The diamond caught the light one final time. "This ring will not be auctioned tonight," he announced. A murmur spread through the crowd. "And beginning tomorrow morning, a full investigation into Charles Mercer's activities and the records mentioned in these documents will begin." Several board members immediately looked uncomfortable. Richard noticed. This time, he did not look away. The rain continued beyond the windows while the ballroom slowly absorbed the truth. At the center of it all stood a housekeeper who had refused to let silence bury what mattered most. 3 months later, the Whitmore estate felt different. Not because the marble floors had changed or the gardens had grown more beautiful. The difference lived in the silence. It was no longer the heavy silence of grief. It was the quiet that comes after a storm finally passes. Early morning sunlight spilled across the eastern lawn, painting long golden shadows over the dew-covered grass. Birds moved between the hedges. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the old oak trees lining the driveway. Inside the mansion, the day had already begun. Staff members moved through the halls carrying out familiar routines. Yet something had changed there too. People smiled more often. Doors remained open longer. Conversations lingered. The house no longer felt like a monument to loss. It felt alive again. Maya Brooks stood near a second-floor window holding a soft cloth in one hand. Sunlight reflected across the glass as she carefully polished the final corner. It was the same work she had done for years. The same uniform. The same quiet rhythm. She never asked for a promotion. Never asked for recognition. Never asked for attention. The truth had never been about her. It had always been about keeping a promise. Outside, a black sedan rolled slowly up the circular driveway. Maya glanced toward it briefly before returning to her work. She already knew who it was. Richard Whitmore stepped from the vehicle carrying a small velvet box beneath one arm. His movements seemed lighter now. Not carefree. Life had changed him too much for that. But the burden he carried for 5 years was finally gone. The investigation into Charles Mercer had uncovered exactly what Eleanor described. Financial records, hidden accounts, manufactured rumors. Layer after layer of deception carefully designed to divide two people who trusted the wrong man. The truth had emerged piece by piece. And with it came something Richard never expected to recover. Peace. He entered the mansion quietly and made his way toward the east wing. Staff members greeted him as he passed. He greeted them back. Months ago that would have been unusual. Today it felt natural. Eventually, he reached the second-floor hallway. Maya was still standing near the window. The morning light illuminated the polished glass beside her. Richard stopped several feet away. Neither spoke immediately. The moment did not require many words. Finally, he held out the velvet box. Maya looked at it, but did not take it. "Mrs. Whitmore's ring?" she asked softly. Richard nodded. "It belongs where it always belonged." Together they walked down the long hallway toward the library. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking the gardens Eleanor loved. Near the fireplace stood a framed photograph of her laughing beside a fountain on a summer afternoon years ago. Richard opened the velvet box one final time. The ring sparkled beneath the morning light. Then he placed it beside the photograph. Not hidden, not locked away, not treated as evidence or regret. Simply remembered for what it truly represented. Love, trust, truth. Maya looked at the photograph and smiled faintly. Richard noticed. "She would have liked this," he said. Maya nodded. "I think she already does." The breeze outside rustled the leaves beyond the window. Somewhere in the distance, birds sang across the gardens. Neither of them spoke again. They simply stood there as sunlight filled the room. A billionaire and a housekeeper. No longer separated by status, assumptions, or silence. Only connected by the memory of a woman who believed the truth was worth protecting. The morning light settled across the photograph, the ring, and the polished wood beneath them. And in the quiet that followed, it felt as though justice itself had finally learned how to whisper.